Welcome. I'm Eric Fleming, host of A Moment with Eric Fleming, the podcast of our time. I want to personally thank you for listening to the podcast. If you like what you're hearing, then I need you to do a few things. First, I need subscribers. I'm on Patreon at patreon.com/A Moment with Eric Fleming. Your subscription allows an independent podcaster like me the freedom to speak truth to power and to expand and improve the show. Second, leave a 5-star review for the podcast on the streaming service you listen to it. That will help the podcast tremendously. Third, go to the website, momenteric.com. There you can subscribe to the podcast, leave reviews and comments, listen to past episodes, and even learn a little bit about your host. Lastly, don't keep this a secret like it's your own personal guilty pleasure. Tell someone else about the podcast. Encourage others to listen to the podcast and share the podcast on your social media platforms because it is time to make this moment a movement. Thanks in advance for supporting the podcast of our time. I hope you enjoy this episode as well.
The following program is hosted by the NBG Podcast Network.
Hello, and welcome to another Moment with Eric Fleming. I am your host, Eric Fleming, and today we have a jam-packed podcast. Yeah, what started out maybe a couple of guests, we got four of the sharpest, most intelligent people that come on and talk about the volatility that's going on, whether it's dealing with American politics, what's going on in the Middle East, or even the economy. We are living in some volatile times. And so I have four people coming on who are going to break down this volatile moment in our society. And hopefully you will get some enlightenment. Hopefully you will get some hope and some encouragement. And maybe get us to start thinking more about solutions, whether it's changing of the electorate or lining up on issues, shaping your opinion on issues more clearly, that kind of thing. So this is really, really a challenging time as well as being volatile. And so I am really grateful that I've been able to have these guests come on, and hopefully you will enjoy this program as well. So since it's a jam-packed show, we're going to go ahead and get it started. And as always, we started off with a moment of news with Grace G.
Thanks, Eric. President Trump reversed steep tariffs on multiple nations, citing financial market turmoil and surging bond yields as motivators. Millions globally protested President Trump and Elon Musk over perceived attacks on democracy and billionaire overreach, with demonstrations in all 50 states and internationally. A second unvaccinated child with no underlying health conditions died from measles-related pulmonary failure in Texas amid an outbreak of nearly 500 cases across Texas and New Mexico. The U.S. Senate and House each passed their version of a budget plan to extend Trump-era tax cuts and reduce spending. A federal judge allowed a defamation lawsuit by the Central Park Five against Donald Trump over his 2024 campaign comments to proceed. The National Park Service restored mentions of Harriet Tubman's slavery and the Fugitive Slave Act it had removed from its Underground Railroad webpage. President Trump dismissed NSA Director Timothy Haugh following a meeting with far-right activist Laura Loomer. The U.S. Supreme Court blocked a federal judge's order requiring the Trump administration to rehire thousands of dismissed probationary workers. The North Carolina Supreme Court temporarily halted an appellate ruling that would invalidate over 60,000 ballots in a contested state Supreme Court race. A federal judge ordered the White House to restore the Associated Press's access after restrictions were imposed over its coverage referring to the Gulf of Mexico. 3 U.S. citizens imprisoned in Congo for a failed coup were transferred to American custody after their death sentences were commuted. 3 U.S. aid workers in Myanmar were abruptly laid off during earthquake relief efforts amid U.S. aid budget cuts, hampering disaster response as the death toll climbs to 3,645. And a nightclub roof collapse in the Dominican Republic killed 221 people and injured over 189. I am Grace G., and this has been A Moment of News.
All right. Thank you, Grace, for that moment of news. And now it is time for our guest, Alan Elrod. Alan Elrod is the president and CEO of the Pulaski Institution, a new think tank dedicated to the connection between global politics and economics and heartland areas. He lives outside Little Rock, Arkansas. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my distinct honor and privilege to have as a guest on this podcast, Alan Elrod. All right. Alan Elrod. Professor Alan Elrod. How you doing, sir? You doing good?
Doing well. I'm doing well. How about you?
I'm doing good. I'm glad to have you on. I want to talk about this think tank that you've put together and just some of your thoughts about what's going on in the political world, especially from your vantage point, which is the great state of Arkansas. At one point in my life, I was designated as an Arkansas traveler. So I hold that in great distinction.
All right. I love that.
Yeah. So normally how I start the interviews, Alan, is that I throw a couple of icebreakers out there. So the first icebreaker is a quote. And the quote is, "Never has our future been more unpredictable. Never have we depended so much on political forces that cannot be trusted to follow the rules of common sense and self-interest. Forces that look like sheer insanity if judged by the standards of other centuries." What does that quote mean to you?
Well, I mean, that's Hannah Arendt. And I used this recently in a piece I wrote. And, in Origins of Totalitarianism, she's talking, I think, about obviously a very specific moment in history. But I think that what that quote evokes speaks a lot to our moment now, because a lot of things don't feel rational. I think, people don't seem to be behaving to the kind of normal rules of politics, right? We just, Donald Trump, even this week, is taking a certain degree of pain in his approval polls. But, after everything, right? After self-sabotaging the economy, after these sort of really clearly authoritarian deportations, he's at -4 in his approval. I remember right before Barack Obama was elected, and yeah, it was a recession, but George W. Bush was in the 20s in his approval rating. And so I think there's something kind of astounding about where the country is at mentally in its willingness to kind of go along with some of this stuff, in the policies that are being enacted that seem to have no real, actual, rational purpose of helping the country. And at the same time, in our I think our unwillingness to accept what's happening. A lot of us, I think, are still in denial about it. We want to tell ourselves, that he won't really do tariffs, then he did them. We want to tell ourselves that he doesn't really want to invade Canada or Greenland. He keeps saying he does. We want to tell ourselves that he won't blow up, right, America's position in the world. He has. So I think, that kind of inability to accept what's happening around us, to me, is also what's evoked by that. It feels like everything feels crazy. And I think that that's true. But I also think that that's sort of the place we have to start from now, that a lot of the old rules are gone.
Yeah. All right. So give me a number between 1 and 20.
Well, let's say 13.
All right. 13. Do you think there is such a thing as unbiased news or media, and why?
Yeah, I do. Now, I think that always has to, if what we mean is, do you think that human beings can do anything without some of their own, I guess, decision making and whatever guides that playing a role? Then no. But do I think, news that is reliable and objective and rigorously checked and presented in a way that's meant to inform can be made? Yeah, I think it, of course. And there are places that still do a really good job of this. I mean, the AP is a wonderful news outlet. You can tune into PBS NewsHour every night and watch really great reporting. Cable news, I think, often is where we get into the problem with this. But the issue is that most cable news is actually editorialism. It's opinion journalism in prime time. And opinion journalism has a place in the ecosystem of journalism. It's just that I think if people assume that opinion journalism is the only journalism that's out there, you're going to end up with this idea that there's no such thing as news that's trying to be sort of rigorous and objective about its reporting. And there is.
Yeah. So what motivated or inspired you to get involved in politics?
Well, I had the, misfortune being raised by a political scientist for a father. I've always been interested. It's always fascinated me. Politics has always been something that I enjoyed. Like learning about the history of politics. I care about certain, issues. I think that's how a lot of people tend to get involved. They're passionate about an issue here or there. I think it helped that when I came of age, right, to vote, 18, my first election was Obama's election. And that was a pretty great election. Barack Obama and John McCain are kind of two wonderful paragons of America. They we had a great, Sarah Palin, I don't have as many charming things to say about, but we had a great election where we elected the first Black president, and he ran against a war hero. It was kind of the best America had to offer, right? And so, if that's your coming of age into elections and politics, you kind of feel pretty good about the country. So, when I was younger, there was a lot, I think, to be excited about, in a sense that, we're all trying to make the country better in different ways. And those feelings are complicated now. But certainly when I was younger, the things that drew me into politics were both personal interest, and I really think, it was kind of a fun time to be interested in politics.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that, a lot of people don't put it in that perspective. Here was an African American running for president of the United States based on the history of what African Americans gone through, running against a legitimate war hero, which, in other times, the military hero usually is the victor. And so, like you said, when you put it in that perspective, yeah, that's probably really the last great election we have had, as far as choices. And it means something for me because I was on the ballot in Mississippi in that '08 election. I was running for the U.S. Senate. So yeah, that's just kind of a cool reflection on that. What is the Pulaski Institution, and why did you feel the need to create it?
So we're a new nonprofit. You could call us think tank. I do. And what we are is an organization that's dedicated to really looking at heartland areas in the context of global politics, and particularly with this notion of place-based democracy. And the idea is that we're seeing, not just in the United States, a retreat in a lot of wealthy democracies from the commitments to liberalism, pluralism, certain economic freedoms that have guided these countries over the last, especially 80 years, to places of remarkable freedom and prosperity, and that it's important to look at why that's happening, but also to actually try to bolster the sort of democratic values and culture that's being developed in these places. It's not just in the United States, it's not just in upstate New York or Maine or Arkansas here, but also in places, like the north of England, where there was a significant Brexit vote, right? Or the parts of France, right, in post-industrial France and southern France, where the politics of Marine Le Pen are quite popular. And to me, there's a sense that if we don't start really having conversations about these places and also understand that they exist, they still do exist in a globalized context, then we are setting ourselves up to just keep getting buffeted every couple of years by another wave, right, of sort of populist angst in different countries, right? Because it's, the United States has its own issues right now with Trump, but, the AfD is still surging in Germany. France is going to have an election in 2027, and right now it's not obvious who's going to run that's going to be able to be more popular than the national rally. So I think there's a lot of concern still, even outside the U.S., for where these forces are going.
Is there a true natural connection between global politics and the heartland?
Absolutely. You can't escape it. It's all coming here, right? One is the fact that the things that a lot of these people are upset about are globalized processes, or at least they perceive them in the sense of like, well, we're being dislocated or we're being undercut, right, by big cosmopolitan cities, But also, the world is globalized. So the idea is travel internationally, right? We had a lot of conversations in the past couple of years about great replacement theory. Well, great replacement theory is a French idea originally. These ideas are traveling. We see, the Ottawa rally, where a lot of the Canadians who participated in that came from the sort of prairie provinces, right, where they sort of took over downtown Ottawa. There's a lot of things about that were evocative of January 6th, and frankly, a lot of online networks that are overlapping with certain American far-right influencers. So one is to understand, I think, that there's a reaction against certain aspects of globalization, but also to understand that globalization itself is actually shaping and feeding some of the forces that are being unleashed in these places.
Yeah. So you are based in Arkansas, the home of Sarah Huckabee Sanders and Tom Cotton, the poster children.
And Johnny Cash, or
well, that's true. That's true too. As a matter of fact, there's a little restaurant right behind the state capitol, Little Rock, that Bill Clinton used to go to, and I think Hunter Thompson. So I got to eat there, so that was pretty cool. But Sanders and Cotton are considered like the poster children for violence and cruelty in American politics. Why do you think that kind of politics or those kind of individuals are appealing in the political atmosphere here?
So I think I should say that obviously I don't think that not everyone who votes for a Republican candidate or someone like Sarah Huckabee Sanders or Tom Cotton is doing so because they're just thrilled by the sort of violent elements or the more authoritarian elements of their politics, right? The South has a long history of being a kind of one-party region that shifted from Democratic to Republican, right, largely on the back of the changes in the Civil Rights era, but it means there's a lot of people who have, frankly, just a sort of reflexive loyalty. But I've made this argument before I did a piece of the Bulwark for it, which is that I just don't think that the South ever fully took to liberal democratic culture in the way the rest of the country did. That there's some excellent histories on this, probably the best one being Heather Cox Richardson's How the South Won the Civil War, that really argue that it's not just the failure of Reconstruction, it's the way that these ideas are cemented after the failure of Reconstruction. The South goes right back into being essentially a racial hierarchy system. But not just that, they invent new ways to, now that they have to deal with the fact that there are technically free Black citizens living in the region, they invent new ways to impose, right, that system electorally. And they manage to package those ideas in ways that can be sold to the public, right, like limited government and kind of these ideas about Washington corruption and a certain paranoid attitude as well. And the reality is that I think that, that culture has never been fully uprooted. We never really did, right, the kind of thoroughgoing dealing with what this meant, right, in the South. And, civil rights came, essentially almost a century later. And even then, I think there has been a tendency to sort of, dust our hands off, pat ourselves on the back and say, we accomplished that, right? And, probably the culmination of that attitude comes, right, with the Shelby v. Holder decision, right? And the Supreme Court saying, well, actually, it's no longer essential that the federal government sort of rigorously enforce these sort of parts of the Voting Rights Act because, mission accomplished. And I would say, no, mission not accomplished, not just in sort of actual sort of measurable data points, but in the culture, which is a little harder to measure, but I think is still very much one where people do just kind of accept a certain degree of illiberalism in their politics here because it's always been there.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. A lot of people, that don't really understand the South. I've been now in the South, God, 42 years of my life. And, people are very nice. People are very, very hospitable. They're very cordial. You can sit down and have a beer and eat barbecue and play football, watch football. You can do a whole lot of things. But when it comes to the politics, though, it's almost like a switch clicks in. And it's just like anything that's related to change, they're allergic to it, right? It's just like, every human being loves sugar, but we're all addicted to it. So that's why we get fat. With politics, it's the same way with change to me in the South. It's like it's like, well, that's always was the comment like, well, that's just not how we do things around here. It's like, and how's that working out for you? And that usually just frustrate me to death in Mississippi because Mississippi is one of the poorest states in the nation. And anytime we used to try to push for things to try to make life better or at least go in a different direction what we've been doing, I don't know if our folks are ready for that.
Yeah.
And so how do you get around
that? Well, I think we would probably both agree that our frustrations with the South coexist with our love for the South. I do love it. And that has to be there, right? You really aren't going to be able to change this place, this region, without doing it from here, And that's kind of a logic that Pulaski has in general, is that the work has to be done from different places. You got to try to find people who are willing to talk and think and advocate with at least having at least one foot planted in the place they're trying to talk about. I think that's really important because, people need to see that you're invested in it. People need to see that this is a place you're not just talking about to them from a distance. So, that's to me the starting point is you cannot possibly effect change in a place in a really rich and meaningful way that lasts without being invested in it. And so I think that's the other side of it. A lot of people reacted to that piece I wrote with a kind of like, well, the South is terrible. I hate the South. And I was like, I don't hate the South. I love the South. I just want so much more for it.
Yeah. There's an old politician in Mississippi. He's gone on to the other side now, but he used to say, in order to lead the people, you got to love the people.
Yeah.
So I agree with you. In order to do what you need to do, you got to have a love for the place that you're in, and then you got to love the people that are there and just, do the best you can. Why do you think American Christianity has moved from right-wing activism to outright idolatry?
Oh, well, I think there's a lot of different forces at play there. When you look at what a lot of the scholars of sort of Christian nationalism will talk about, I think one thing that's important is there's different strains, right? So, the people who've moved into extremism out of, say, the Catholic right are not talking in exactly the same way as the people who come from a more, charismatic evangelical background. But what I do think is true is, if we're going to try to talk about this specific moment we're in, a lot of Christians decided that Donald Trump was an imperfect vessel for accomplishing a lot of things that they thought were important to accomplish. And the problem is that, with that, I think, is that is a bet in which they had to keep sort of anteing up. They had to keep going deeper and deeper in, right? I think in 2016, the tone to a lot of it felt more transactional, right? Donald Trump, maybe he's not perfect, but he's going to do some things, and Christians have to accept that we live in a world, right, of flesh and blood, and therefore, if you want to get certain things done for the purpose of God, that you don't always get to pick who you work with, right? That, I think, what happened with that is that they got deeper and deeper in, and as you start to justify that, right, I think that the arguments and the kind of ways in which that was sustained, right, that relationship was sustained, it started to push more towards, if all of this is worth it, then there must be something really special here, right? And so Trump becomes not just a kind of, well, we can use him to get done what we've done. He becomes the special chosen man of God. I don't think that's the whole story. And obviously there are nuances, like I said, depending on the sort of theological milieu you come out of within Christianity. But I think that kind of paints the broad picture for what's happened in the last decade.
Yeah, it's kind of staying with the religious thing. It's kind of like, instead of getting the Apostle Paul, you're settling for Saul of Tarsus, right?
Oh yeah,
it's like
no conversion.
That's right. No Damascus Road experience. It's just, we like Saul the way he is. We just want him to go ahead and do his thing, and not elevate himself. And I just wonder why people really, really feel that way. Why they feel that they have to settle for that. I guess maybe in their mindset, somebody who actually was pure probably wouldn't get close enough to be president. I don't know.
I mean, I think it's astonishing how under siege American Christians feel, despite living in a pretty, I think, actually Christian-friendly country. When you have convinced yourself that you are this persecuted minority, I think the kind of things you start to think you're willing to accept to assert your own power get pretty dark, right? I do think you'll hear a lot of the justifications are, well, it's like war has already been declared on us, therefore we should not be afraid to deploy, whatever weapons are in our arsenal. And Donald Trump happens to be, right now, the big one in the repertoire.
Yeah. What will it take for liberalism to be dynamic and inclusive?
One of the things I'm really convinced of right now is that we live in a moment where we need lots of new ideas. And so I think as long as what you need to do is say, the guiding principles for how we think about our problems should be this mixture of respect for individual dignity, pluralism, which means, lots of different people, right, being able to coexist, lots of different groups being able to coexist and participate, mutual toleration, and individual freedom. But then say, okay, those are the guiding principles, but a lot of the things we haven't done, a lot of things we've been doing, maybe they're not working. Maybe we need new ideas. And as long as we're trying to come up with responses to the moment, original responses that still say we're going to adhere to these sort of guiding ideals, then I think that's opening the door for something more dynamic, right? One of the things that I think this goes back to our kind of madness conversation, which is people, I think, really have to accept that we're moving forward past the old status quo is not coming back. We have a chance to decide what we want to happen next. And I think that can be an invigorating thing that we could say, well, what do we want to do in the wake of this? Donald Trump has just laid siege to so many aspects of our government and how things are working. Okay. Is the goal just going to be to go in and sort of, glue the pieces back together and have a slightly more, broken looking, but, kind of fixed system? Or is the goal going to be to go in and say, okay, well, let's be as ambitious about building something new and interesting and dynamic as these people were about trying to destroy it, right? I do think that needs to be there. That energy for creating the future has to be there. Being really reactive and responsive to problems, saying we're going to actually, have big ideas about how we're going to fix the energy crisis, about how we're going to fix the climate crisis, about how we're going to fix, some of these new challenges that are emerging, and making sure that liberalism is the guidepost.
Yeah. It's like, I guess another analogy would be, it's like we know that the president has set everything on fire. So the question is, Do we put the fire out and salvage what's left, or do we just go ahead and let it burn and then rebuild something totally new? Like you said, with more of a liberal or progressive bend to it. That's going to be tough.
Yeah, I'm
Huh?
not an accelerationist. I don't think that we should get rid of the Constitution or anything like that. But there's things where you can look at it and say, look, okay, he's really ransacked a lot of, agencies. When we come back in, if Democrats win in 2028 or something, okay, how are we going to think about putting the government back together? Is it going to just be, okay, everything goes back, we're just going to institute sort of pre-2025 funding? Or are we going to say we need to think really critically about how we want to structure these things and approach, the future moving forward? I also think we probably have to have a serious conversation about how to massively reform ICE, right? It's clear to me that agency is willing to do some, frankly, illegal and unconstitutional things at the president's orders, and that's a cultural problem, and it has to be fixed. I don't know that means, destroying, like eliminating ICE as an agency, but it certainly means reforming it and probably getting rid of a lot of personnel, because that's a huge problem. You cannot have, I think, you cannot be afraid to institute reforms, especially after people have seen what they've seen. They can't unsee, federal agents doing this stuff.
Yeah. And then even a question of like maybe consolidating stuff, right? Because, one of the things we had to deal with a lot in being in the state legislature in Mississippi was because we had limited income, limited revenue, tax revenue, and and people were out there struggling. The question became, do we really need to be as big as we used to be? Right. We had a county, it literally had 40,000 people in it, and we had 6 school districts. So the question was, do we really need to have 6 school districts in a county that only has 40,000 people? And what does that look like? We were electing a superintendent of education for a county that literally did not have a school in the county. and they had consolidated with another county for their kids to go to school. And so we were like, yeah, we probably need to get rid of that position. So I think, the concern that a lot of us have that have been involved in politics and like you say, respect the Constitution, is that we're not against reform or upgrades or, doing what needs some tinkering, but we're not into slashing and burning. That's the problem. It's like, you just can't come in and just destroy and then have somebody who has no concept of government, let alone American government, being the lead point person. I think that's where a lot of people that are rational about the conversation really have some heartburn. And I don't know, but a lot of people that line up on that side are frustrated enough where they decide to let that go. It's like, well, he said he was going to shake some things up. I think that goes back to, when we make the equation that Christians think that Donald Trump is a change agent for their good, they envision him as a Jesus showing up and flipping the tables at the temple, as opposed to being more Herod. You know what I'm saying? I mean, that's just me, but what do you think about that take?
I think it's the human, this is where we get into the fact that there's a lot of things about human nature that make democracy really hard. We're not patient. We want fixes. And there's always been, since democracy has been a thing we've been trying to do as societies, there's always been the temptation to indulge people who are saying, I can fix it. I can fix it right now if you let me do it in these, clearly tyrannical ways, right? And human beings are often tempted to turn power over like that, right? So democracy is, when people say democracy is fragile, one of the things we mean is it's fragile because human beings by their nature, do not always actually want to do things the way democracies do things, which is slow and deliberative and requires consensus and isn't always just going to, smash things up immediately. Now, I think the end result of that is obviously better because that's how you protect freedoms and rights and dignity. But that tension, I think, is always going to be there. It comes to the surface more in different times, but that human desire to have the quick fix, to push past the sort of way democracy tries to tell us to slow down, I think that's always going to be there.
So people are talking about, I hear a lot of the Democrats saying, well, the way things are going, man, we ought to be able to flip the House and flip the Senate in 2026. And, and Donald Trump will basically be a lame duck and all this stuff. What is your take on what American politics will look like in 2026? Because there's some people who are like going, I don't even know if we're going to have an election in 2026 and y'all busy talking about flipping stuff, What do you think American politics is going to look like a year from now?
So I think we should be clear that, there's people who are basically saying we won't have an election in 2026. There are some very serious people who are saying, hey, this is on my radar and I have some concerns about what the Trump administration might try to do. I think it's worth taking the serious people seriously when they say things like that. At the same time, we're not there yet, so there's not a lot we can do. It's speculative. What I would, I think, say in terms of how the actual elections might play out is it looks right now like Democrats are probably going to have a good midterm. I think that, they had a good midterm in 2018. A lot of things are maybe even worse now than in 2017, 2018, leading up to those midterms. So there's lots of reasons to think Democrats, the early data that we've seen out of some of the special elections in Wisconsin and even the Florida races where Republicans won, but won by much less in heavily Republican districts than they normally would, all suggest things shifting towards Democrats. What I would say to that is I'm still worried about living in a country where every few years we're willing to indulge, right, people like Donald Trump. Right? Donald Trump was president, and then COVID happened, and 1 million Americans died, in part because Donald Trump actively mismanaged that crisis. And then after he was voted out of office, he staged a coup to try to stay in office, where his supporters said they wanted to kill his vice president. And then 4 years later, because, Joe Biden was pretty old and we replaced him last minute with Kamala Harris and prices were higher than some people would like, we returned Donald Trump to office. And I think that if that's the cycle we're in, that's not very encouraging. So I'm optimistic about Democrats' chances in 2026 and even maybe in 2028, but I am concerned about where the country is at, that we are going to be in a situation where if the Democrats aren't essentially perfect, we just might vote back in, and after 2028, it might not be right Trump, but, a J.D. Vance or someone else who is just completely on board with what we've seen to be a deeply authoritarian, reckless, chaotic form of government. And that does concern me because I don't think Democrats winning in 2026 or even in 2028 necessarily expunges, right, that particular problem from our democracy.
Yeah. Yeah. It's or exercise even. it's going to be a Herculean task, but you have decided to jump in the fray with the Pulaski Institution. So tell people how people can reach out to you, how they can get involved with the Pulaski Institution. Just go ahead and plug away on how people can get engaged.
We are found at PulaskiInstitution.org. You can also we do a podcast that I put out every so often with experts and guests. It's not weekly, but I try to, whenever I can get good people, we do an episode or two in a couple weeks around when we put those out. That is called The Periphery from the Pulaski Institution, and it is available across all platforms. You can also find, the writing I do at Arc Digital or at Liberal Currents or other places like the Bulwark. And, that usually is stuff that's oriented towards the kind of things we're thinking about at Pulaski. If you're in the Oklahoma City area, we are going to be doing an event in Oklahoma City on April 24th at the Tower Theater with one of our fellows, Dr. Allison Schurtle, who's a professor at OU, and some other guests. And so we're going to be talking a little bit about democracy and Christian nationalism and extremism, particularly as it relates to Oklahoma. I think that's going to be fun. So yeah, we're going to be trying to bring more events to different places to have that kind of local conversation about what's happening. And that stuff will usually be posted there. Or you can follow me on Blue Sky, where I talk about that stuff all the time. I am at AS Elrod. So that's my spiel for how you can get in touch with us. And, I hope people will.
Well, I don't know, Rod. It's been an honor to talk to you, brother. I've read some of your stuff on Liberal Current, and when we connected on LinkedIn, I was like, okay, yeah, this is going to be cool. Because, I'm of an age now where it's like, the podcast might be the extent of my political activity other than voting. Right. And so we need younger folks that are very thoughtful, very deliberative to kind of pass the torch and carry it in order to ensure that we still have a thriving democracy. And I view you as one of those people. So thank you for doing what you're doing. And thank you and of course you're a teacher. So, political science, I love that part from you, but just keep doing what you're doing. And thank you again for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right, guys. And we're going to catch y'all on the other side. All right, and we are back. And so now it is time for my next two guests, Zaha Hassan and Lara Friedman. Zaha Hassan is a human rights lawyer and a fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Her research focus is on Palestine-Israel peace, transnational repression, and shrinking civic space for Palestine-Israel discourse, the use of international legal mechanisms by political movements, and U.S. foreign policy in the region. Previously, she was the coordinator and senior legal advisor to the Palestinian negotiating team during Palestine's bid for UN membership and was a member of the Palestinian delegation to Quartet-sponsored exploratory talks between 2011 and 2012. Her most recent publication is a co-edited book, Suppressing Dissent, Shrinking Civic Space, Transnational Repression, and Palestine-Israel. Lara Friedman is the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. She is a leading authority on the Middle East with particular expertise on U.S. foreign policy in the region, on Israel-Palestine, and on the way Middle East and Israeli-Palestine-related issues play out in Congress and in U.S. domestic politics, policies, and legislation. Lara is also a preeminent subject matter expert in the area of anti-Palestinian legislation and lawfare, including the weaponization and instrumentalization of the definition of and concerns about anti-Semitism. Lara's research on lawfare and anti-Semitism-related topics, which she makes available to the public, is widely cited and widely recognized as the authoritative data in the field. Lara is a former officer in the U.S. Foreign Service with diplomatic postings in Jerusalem, Washington, Tunis, and Beirut. She also served previously as the Director of Policy and Government Relations at Americans for Peace Now. In addition to her work with FMEP, Lara is a non-resident fellow at the U.S. Middle East Project. She holds a BA from the University of Arizona and a master's degree from Georgetown School of Foreign Service. In addition to English, Lara speaks French, Arabic, Spanish, some Italian, and molds through in Hebrew. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor and privilege to have as guests on this podcast, Zaha Hassan and Lara Friedman. All right. Zaha Hassan. How you doing, ma'am? You doing good?
I'm doing okay, thanks.
Yeah, I'm trying to get your first name right, but we'll just forgive me for that. So I understand, Ms. Hassan, that you brought a friend with you to the program. Go ahead and introduce the audience to her.
Oh, yes, this is my partner in crime, Lara Friedman. She's the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace in Washington, D.C. She's also a former U.S. diplomat that was based in Jerusalem. It's good to be with her. And she's also a contributor to a recently released book that I co-edited called Suppressing Dissent: Shrinking Civic Space, Transnational Repression, and Palestine-Israel.
Well, Ms. Friedman, it's good to have you on the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, ma'am. All right, guys. So normally what I do is I do like a little icebreaker thing at the beginning. So the first one is a quote. The quote goes, "Repressing speech is never the end of a problem, but rather the beginning of one." Which one of y'all want to take that first?
Well, I'll start us off. I think it's also a symptom of a larger problem, right? Because when you start repressing speech, it's because there's some idea that you don't want others to know about, you don't want others to subscribe to. So how do you deal with it if you can't counter it with a stronger idea? Is you shut down the space for being able to express that idea.
Ms. Friedman, did you go ahead?
Sorry. Yeah, no, I agree with Zaha. I think it certainly when it comes to issues related to Palestine, there have been moments across history, particularly in the 90s when it looked like there was, maybe they called the peace process and all of that, when speech was much less suppressed. And it was much less suppressed because there actually was a battle of ideas and there were ways to defend against criticism if you were, someone who didn't like your criticism of Israel. And what we're in a moment here where it's been a long time coming, where it's simply not possible any longer to defend what is happening on the ground. And this isn't unique to Palestine related issues. I'm very myopically focused on this issue, but for when it comes to the Palestine issue, and it dates back before the current just catastrophe that we're going to talk about, for a long time now, it's simply not been possible to come up with arguments to defend what Israel is doing to Palestinians. And then what's left is to try to delegitimize, discredit, and suppress the people who are making the criticism, so that way you don't have to contend with the facts.
Yeah. All right. So which one of y'all want to pick a number between 1 and 20?
13.
Okay. All right. Do you think there is such a thing as unbiased news or media, and why?
That's a great question. I guess for me, the question is less whether, I don't think anything is unbiased. Everyone brings their biases to everything they say. It has to do with how they view the world. When it comes to news, I think it's less a question of whether or not there is bias in everything, and more a question of whether or not that bias becomes or is used to actually obfuscate, to mislead, to effectively say, don't believe your eyes, believe what I'm telling you. Don't believe the facts, believe what I'm spinning. So for me, it's less a question of the bias in the news and how that bias comes out and what role it plays.
I agree totally with that. I think that the problem that we face with news is that there's a certain perspective that's given a lot of airtime, a certain perspective that, the camera lens is focused on. And then there's a whole other side and a whole other history and context that is excluded from the news. And that makes for a skewed presentation of, the so-called facts. And I think that's why there's been a lot of gravitation, especially by younger generation towards social media because it's sort of this eyewitness on the ground account, and it's filling a void that is in the mainstream press, the mainstream TV news in particular, that doesn't focus on what's exactly happening on the ground and how it's affecting real people in real time. And so this is why there's been such an interest and such a growth in social media, precisely because certain perspectives are excluded on the mainstream.
Yeah. So
Can I add something?
Go ahead.
I mean, a piece of it that I think is really, and this is clear to, I think, to anyone who works on an issue, which is, dealing with a disfavored or less powerful sort of political position in the bias in news is the sort of unconscious or unrecognized bias. And this is something for folks who work on anything related to Palestinians that is very clear. And it's when you see ostensibly, mainstream, not biased press choose words like, Palestinians claim, or, so it's alleged. Anytime anything comes from Palestinians, it's immediately discredited with this very subtle bias in the language that's used. Israel states, Israel says this happened. It's actually anything Israel says is stated as fact. This happened. Anything Palestinians said is set up as a claim that is disproven, even when we have a video proving that it's accurate, right? As they're reporting on a video that shows something happening in real time, it's still framed as Palestinians claim this happened. And that there's something incredibly insidious about that sort of bias, because it creeps into people's perception to just assume that you can't believe anything from one side and that you must take as fact the other, even when in sort of in the fullness of time, it's proven that really pretty much everything that you're hearing Palestinians quote unquote claim did happen. And Israel, when it's proven that it happened, has to constantly change its story. It's this unconscious bias that creeps in and sort of tilts things, tilts people's perceptions in profound ways.
All right. So I'm going to put a pin on that because I want to come right back to that. You used the word perception, so I want to get back to that. I want to go back in time real quick, and we'll do it. If you want to explain your answer, cool. But a simple yes or no will do for either one of you. And this is what I call the Rashida Tlaib question, right? So should the Congresswoman have been allowed to speak at the DNC? Yes or no?
Yes.
Of course.
Okay.
I mean,
it doesn't even require explanation.
Right. I mean,
yeah. That's why I couched it the way.
More than Rashida, I mean, it's the concerted effort that was made to prevent any Palestinians from speaking at the convention, even though there was an Israeli speaker that was speaking to the harm to Israeli families by the taking of hostages after October 7th or on October 7th. There was an opportunity to have a Palestinian speaker to talk about the harms to Palestinians by the aftermath of October 7th. And a Palestinian speaker who also happens to be an American, who also happens to be a Democrat, who also happens to be a legislator in Georgia, a state that the Democratic Party very much wanted to see a win in. And they excluded that Palestinian speaker. Why? Because she didn't fit the profile of what's considered an acceptable speaker on the main stage. And they threw an election over this idea of not being an inclusive party, which is bizarre and just shows you how deep it runs in our politics. This idea that, Palestinians, Muslims, Arabs, they're not legitimate. They're not a part of our, party, the Democratic Party. There's something just wrong with this group of citizens, and somehow it's okay to exclude them.
And to exclude them even when there is clear popular demand for them. I mean, that was the part that is the most surreal. Over the many years I worked on this issue, I've had people say to me, listen, Palestine is not the most important issue in the world. There's other issues. Why do you keep wanting to get this into the conversation? And I can explain why I think it's important to be in the conversation all the time. But now, given what's happening, the grassroots that in theory that convention was supposed to be appealing to and responding to wanted to talk about Palestine. And a leadership decided it was simply not permitted.
Yeah, I think it was a missed opportunity. I was there in Chicago. I was fortunate enough to talk to some of the demonstrators, and had one young lady on the podcast, and I just felt it was a missed opportunity. I think Congresswoman Tlaib probably would have been the best person to really articulate. I don't have any problem with the young lady that's the state representative here, but I think Congresswoman Tlaib would have been the perfect person to reframe the issue. And again, this all goes into this perception question I'm going to lead to, but I'm going to go ahead and skip on because I know we've got a limited amount of time. What is the current situation now with the people in Gaza?
Well, I don't have a word, to be honest with you. I think we overused catastrophe, apocalyptic. I mean, I don't know what word to use anymore because I don't think we've ever seen something like this where you have people now for over a month have been cut off from food, water, from any kind of supplies from the outside. Humanitarian assistance as the population is completely dependent on humanitarian assistance because of sort of how Gaza has been de-developed and how it's become dependent on Israel for everything. It's a population that also has been facing regular bombardment since the ceasefire ended. And we know that, more than 50,000 people have already been killed. We know that over 100,000 are injured. We know that we've got the most population of children that have lost limbs, the highest population of children that are orphaned in conflict. It's a nightmarish situation. And we are, unless something's done, unless, the borders are opened and supplies are brought in the next couple of weeks, we're talking about, mass starvation. I mean, just today we heard reports about that we're already seeing children, facing starvation and famine. It's unbelievable that in these modern times that we could allow this to happen. I say we, meaning the United States, a country that's supposed to be sort of this bastion of democracy and human rights and, this light unto the world, that we're actually partners with Israel in the prosecution of what's happening in Gaza. And it seems like there's no one else around the world that's willing to, to stand out and push Israel to end the blockade that it's imposed, that it's had really in place for, the greater part of the, 2 decades, but now strictly imposed to really force the Palestinians to want to leave. And those who don't will have to face the consequences of what we're seeing right now. And I just, I don't have words for what's happening on the ground, but I also, I can't explain the lack of humanity that I see as well. Not from good people that we've seen, especially on these college campuses, students risking everything, but just from elected officials, this sort of apathy to what's taking place. It's really been shocking to me, to be honest.
Laura, did you want to add anything to that?
Look, I mean, this is a year and a half into what is almost the unimaginable reality of a live stream genocide. It is live streamed. Anybody who wants to know what's happening in Gaza, get online. We have a year and a half now of either Israeli soldiers putting the videos up themselves, showing what they're doing. We have drone footage of cities just reduced to rubble. We have statements from Israeli officials laying out exactly what their intention is. And for those of us who very early on in this war on Gaza, because it's not really a war with Gaza, it's a war on Gaza, said the clear intent that is being expressed and that we are seeing implemented from almost day one in response to the October 7th Hamas attacks on Israel. The clear intent here is to eradicate Palestinians from Gaza, erase them. get all the people out, erase every trace of them ever being there, and then move forward. And today, that is pretty much the explicit policy of the Israeli government. They are now demolishing the ruins of any homes that are left in areas because they don't want Palestinians to come back. They are declaring that more than 50% of Gaza is now a buffer zone where Palestinians will never be again. And they are day by day with more of these orders demanding the Palestinians move. These are Palestinians who've been moving over and over and over, carrying whatever they can on their backs, less and less as their family members are slowly picked off and get sicker and hungrier, and moving them into a smaller and smaller area of Gaza, which they are still bombing. And the clear intent, which they are now unabashed in saying, because they say this is Trump's policy, we love it. We agree with Trump. We need to get everybody out. Palestinians can move somewhere else. If they stay here, they're all going to die. And they should be permitted, quote unquote, permitted to voluntarily leave. And voluntarily means they can stay here and die, or they can get out. That's not voluntary. That is ethnic cleansing, and is ethnic cleansing as part of a policy of genocide, which is systematically erasing Palestinian presence, Palestinian history, Palestinian possibility of ever existing again in Gaza.
You know what got me? Sorry, I just wanted to add, this was the most sickest sort of cynical statement from the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu when he was saying, it's so unbelievable how, Palestinians, should have a choice of where to go. And they're not being given choice because the rest of the world won't absorb the Palestinians, and, without any self-consciousness that most of the Palestinians in Gaza are refugees from inside Israel, what became the state of Israel, or the descendants of refugees. So the place that they should go that's not preventing them to return is actually Israel. But he was able to say this statement as though, the rest of the world is heartless. Why won't they take these Palestinians that clearly want to leave? Why would they want to stay after Israel's taken away every essential item of life from them and destroyed the entire Gaza Strip? Of course they want to leave, he says, and the rest of the world won't take them. I mean, as though the rest of the world needs to comply with his interest in seeing Gaza completely emptied of its population to further his greater Israel designs.
Hypocrisy and irony seems to be common speech in politics nowadays. What would be the impact of the United States gentrification of Gaza in the realm of not just with the Palestinians and the Israelis, but also in that Middle East region? What would be that impact?
I mean, I just don't even think it's a real idea. I hope that President Trump is saying these things because he's trying to spur, the Arab governments in the region, including the Palestinians, to come up with a plan on governance of Gaza, come up with a plan for Gaza's security that could work. And they have done this. They have come up with a plan. It's consistent with international law. It's consistent with Palestinians being in control of their own future and rebuilding Gaza in a way that supports a political solution in which Palestinians can self-determine and have sovereignty. This is not a plan that Israel likes. Obviously, they want to see no Palestinians, not only in Gaza, by the way. I mean, they don't want to see Palestinians in the West Bank either. They are moving just as fast in the West Bank to try to deploy mechanisms to force Palestinians out. They're using settlers to drive Palestinians out with pogroms. They're having soldiers destroy Palestinian refugee camps. We've seen 40,000 Palestinians forced out of their homes in these camps without anywhere to go. So, I don't think President Trump's ideas are serious, but let's pretend that he does intend to do this, that he intends to take over Gaza and force the Palestinians out and start to rebuild. I mean, this is not something that Egypt's going to be down with. It's not a plan that any of Israel's neighbors are going to be down with, because they understand what this is going to mean. It's going to mean perpetual conflict. It's going to mean a destruction of the peace agreements that Israel has with its neighbors, because this is going to turn the entire region into just one big violent mess. So I hope President Trump's using these kinds of statements to goad others, but I don't think it's a serious solution here. Obviously, it violates every notion we have of international law or human rights to think that in this day and age we're going to have a colonial settlement constructed by the United States in the Middle East.
I'll just add, I mean, I sadly actually do take him seriously. This is an administration that in its first term, it basically created a new concept of international law when it said that Israel had a right to annex the Golan Heights. We recognize the Golan Heights as part of Israel. And the framing for that decision was, of course, they have a right to keep land that they have acquired in a defensive war. Nobody should have to give back land that they're being attacked from. I think that framing, which was just treated as obvious and, matter of fact, you can claim land and, it's as if people don't matter and the rights of the people on land don't matter. I mean, that was the policy under the previous, under the first Trump term. I take him seriously when he looks at this and says, this is an easy problem, get rid of the people and redevelop it. Israel has basically since its birth as a state has operated from we will achieve fait accompli on the ground. We won't ask for permission. We won't ask for forgiveness. We'll do it and the world will accept it. And we'll spin it as this is why we're right. And anyone who disagrees with us is an anti-Semite and doesn't know what's good for them. And in this context right now with the Trump administration as a partner, I think the intent is to achieve as many of these faits accompli as they can, including in Syria, where they're taking more and more land, including in Lebanon, including in the West Bank, with the idea this is an historic opportunity to change. It's not just changing the rules of the game, it's clearing the board and creating a new board that the region will go forward with. And basically, assuming that between Israel's military strength and the support of the world and, the alliances that they will make out of convenience against Iran or because of, the transactional alliances with Arab states that are prone to that they'll get away with it. And I think it's possible to imagine from the perspective of an Israeli who views this as, their greater Israel agenda given to them by God, that they think they really do have this opportunity. They don't see obstacles at this point.
All right. So my final two questions is based off of this premise that I brought out. Some would argue that the current Palestinian-Israeli conflict has created a new era of McCarthyism. So, one, why do you think it is acceptable in the United States to muzzle the free speech of Palestinians and their supporters? And two, what can be done to change public perception of the Palestinian people?
Well, I actually don't think that people are accepting this notion that you should muzzle Palestinians and not allow them to protest or dissent or to show opposition to U.S. foreign policy or to show disapproval with the policies of a university administration. I think that people are waking up to well, this is very dangerous. If you can silence one group of people, one vulnerable group of people, in this case, that what we're seeing now, immigrants, people that are visa holders, lawful permanent residents, if you can silence those individuals, who's next? And so people are making the connection with this idea that, the U.S. should not be allowed to shut down protest against the government, against government policies, because it doesn't like, it doesn't like the ideas that are being advanced. Once we set that precedent, that will be used with every other group. It will be expanded. We've seen it time and time again, where we've adopted policies, first testing them out on the most vulnerable among us, seeing whether it can fly, especially through the courts system. And then we start to apply them more broadly. I think about sort of before 9/11, for example, the first people that had used against them terrorism laws to try to silence them, to try to prosecute them without being able to show evidence by having secret evidence, the use of secret evidence. And these were Palestinians that were being prosecuted with secret evidence. And then 9/11 happened. And because they got away with it with Palestinians, it started being used more broadly, not just with Muslims and Arabs, but it started being used with anyone that was, quote unquote, a terrorist. And that terrorism label got thrown around to a lot of different people, domestic and foreign. So, I mean, we have lived through that. It's in people's memory, and they're seeing this happen now with speech on campus, and they're understanding that they have to stand up for what's right here and what's consistent with our Constitution and our freedoms in a democratic society. Because if we don't push back against this, this is going to become the new normal.
Yeah, I agree with everything Zaha just said. I'll just add, I mean, I've been using the term new McCarthyism. Feels like we're going to Red Scare. The claim that this is anti-American. I mean, we've seen this building since under the Biden administration. I think a lot of where we are right now, the path was laid by the Biden administration, which is what it is. But I think that what is maybe different right now, I think all of us are none of us lived through the McCarthy era, but we've all studied it. I mean, one of the things that is, I think, very different right now is that in that era, you had an administration cynically weaponizing fears about communism, which were massively overblown, massively overstated, right? There wasn't a massive communist support within the U.S. There is massive support for Palestinians now. This is why there's this absolute imperative to shut this down, because so many Americans, not just students, have over the past year and a half seen what's happened and said, this cannot be permitted. I don't want my taxpayer dollars supporting this. I want us to stand up to it. So it's a very different thing to try to shut it down and expect people to kind of, hide and say, I don't want to get in trouble. People are very far on a limb already. And if the argument is going to be that, for instance, the young man from Colombia who they're trying to deport, well, yesterday we saw the government statement for why they're trying to deport him. They're not saying he broke any laws. They're saying his ideas, what he believes, are a challenge, are a problem for U.S. national security. Well, if what he believes are somehow illegal, so he has to be deported for U.S. national security, then what a huge tens of thousands or millions of Americans believe. Effectively, they're saying that that's also not allowed for national security reasons. It's not for nothing that they started their attack on immigrants and their attack on visa holders with people focused on Palestine. They saw it as a political winner, right? Democrats are afraid to defend them because they don't want to be called anti-Semites and pro-terror. Republicans love it. It's red meat. And what they're seeing, I think, is a lot more pushback than they expected, which I think that's just going to get stronger.
All right. Well, Ms. Hassan, I know you got to go. Ms. Friedman, I greatly appreciate both of y'all coming on to the podcast and talking about this issue. I wish we had a little more time, but both of y'all have an open invitation to come back. I know Ms. Hassan has basically said you can reach her at Zaha Hassan on X. Ms. Friedman, how can people get in touch with you, and how can people get a copy of the book that y'all put together?
So you can find me also on X at Lara Friedman DC, Lara Friedman DC. And you can get a copy of the book. It's available on any place where you buy books. I don't want to recommend any specific booksellers, but it is widely available anywhere you want to buy books. I'd encourage people to go to independent bookstores and buy it in person. That's always better.
Yeah, and give the name of the book again. I'm sorry.
Oh, now you tricked me. I don't have it in front of me. Can you pull that up for the show notes?
Yeah, I'll tell the listeners how to get it.
The time moves so fast. The book, which only came out recently, feels like it came out a lifetime ago at this point.
Well, I know it's been a lifetime work with you and Ms. Hassan in speaking up and hopefully my wish is that, the majority of Americans will have an open mind on this. I think part of the problem has been, as you had stated earlier, it's been very one-sided, and politically we've been socialized that way. But I hope with the work that you and Ms. Hassan are doing and this new generation of leaders coming up, that we'll have a more open dialogue. So I thank y'all.
I join you in that hope very strongly, and thank you for all you do.
All right, guys, we're going to catch y'all on the other side. All right, ladies and gentlemen, as a bonus treat, even though the subject is not necessarily a treat, I have my good friend, Rick Roberts. Rick has been a guest on the program. He was scheduled to come back on, and he submitted some information that I read to y'all dealing with these tariffs and the basics about what tariffs are. Rick is a specialist professor in the Department of Economics, Finance, and Real Estate at Monmouth University. And he is a true believer in the open invitation. When I said, anytime you want to come on, you can. And Rick is taking advantage of that, either at being a guest or submitting some information. So, Rick, it's good to have you on.
Thanks. Always happy to be here, Eric.
Well, I need you to explain now so President Trump has decided to lift the tariffs off of some of the countries that he had the tariffs on. He still got it going on with China, and China has responded. But he took the tariffs off, and one of the issues that he cited was the surging bond yields as one of the reasons why he decided to lift a lot of those tariffs. Explain why bond yields or surging bond yields, however he put it out there, would make a decision, make him make that kind of a decision.
Great. That's a great question. The bond yields were increasing. Let's first answer, why were they going up anyway? And then why, given that they went up, did that encourage Trump to pull off the tariffs or back off on many of them? So the bond market interest rates were going up, frankly, because of the tariffs that Trump was threatening. And then on so-called Liberation Day, he was calling it, he announced, as you correctly stated, a broad set of very high tariffs against most trading partners and extremely high against China. I mean, as an aside, there was no rhyme or rhythm to his calculations. I don't know any economist, serious or frankly not serious economist, who could figure out where he came up with those numbers. But nevertheless, he announced some pretty meaty tariffs across the board. And well, as I believe, in fact, I heard what you said on your prior podcast. So you referenced some notes that I'd shared with you. Tariffs increase inflation. There's not much debate about that. Right? If the good that you buy that's made overseas is now getting taxed at our border, it's going to be more expensive when you buy it. So your Amazon products or whatever, not that they're all from overseas, but I know many of the ones I purchase are made overseas. They're going to now be more expensive. That's inflation. And even more importantly, U.S. producers of products, U.S. manufacturers, now how would they be impacted by tariffs on foreign products? Well, they are, because U.S. manufacturers largely rely, at least some, on foreign inputs into their manufacturing process. So, for example, if I own a bicycle company, I'm making bicycles in the U.S. and I import my tires because they're cheap. And this is hypothetical, but just to give you and your listeners a example here. So if I'm making a bicycle here in the U.S. and I import my tires because they're cheaper overseas, if those tires now become more expensive, that increases my cost to make my bicycle, right? And, what am I going to do? Where am I going to get that money to pick up the extra cost associated with the higher import prices, the higher cost of my tires? Well, I have two options. And the extremes are, I could be super nice and take that extra money for the tires that I now have to pay out of my profits. And at the other extreme, I could just pass that whole extra cost on to my consumers, who the buyers of my bicycle. I could say, hey, it's costing me more to build this bicycle now. My tires are more expensive. You have to pay more. And the fact is, the reality is somewhere between the two. A company will typically eat some of that increased cost from their profits, but pass the bulk of it on to the consumer. So that's a second example of inflation hitting the consumer. It's not that they're buying the product from overseas, like the Amazon example, right? It's more they're buying a U.S. product, but that product made in the U.S. relies on inputs from overseas, and that will raise the product price, and that's inflation as well. And even U.S. cars, there's only 2 cars made in the U.S. that are totally made with U.S. products, and oddly, those cars are Tesla and Rivian. They're produced totally with U.S. products. Even your Ford trucks, your GM trucks, and so forth. These are U.S. produced, but they rely on about anywhere from 25 to 50% or even higher in some situations of the truck itself. The parts are made overseas, so they have to get these parts from overseas. And if they're going to be more expensive, those products are going to be more expensive. So that's the tariff story as you relayed to your listeners last time. I repeat it because it's a little confusing for most folks who don't deal with this, right? But so we think higher inflation because of tariffs. Now, the Federal Reserve is the policymaker and what's a policymaker do? They stare at an economic policymaker stares at the economy, and if it's going fine, that's the end of their job, basically. But if it's not going fine, they try to fix it. And the Federal Reserve is a policymaker. So if they're looking at the economy and they look at it and say, is it going fine? They look at 2 things. They look at employment and they look at inflation. And either one of those readings, the employment numbers or the inflation numbers, aren't to their liking, they try to fix that. And the way they fix that is they use a tool that they have in their toolkit, if you will, and it's interest rates. So, for example, inflation, as you know, has been high since COVID. It's come down quite a bit, but it's not back to where it needs to be. The Federal Reserve targets 2% inflation, and it's been, although it has come down from 7%, it's been hanging around 3%, a little lower this morning, although those numbers are a little misleading. We shouldn't get too excited about it, but inflation's been high. It hasn't never returned to normal, and the Fed was continuing to fight it. However, now we have these tariffs in place that, if they go through as threatened, are going to pose a lot of upward pressure on prices, and we're going to have even higher inflation. And how does the Federal Reserve deal with inflation? That means they're going to raise interest rates. So the market was anticipating, and this is what led to the higher rates in bonds. The market participants were out there saying, in so many words, wait a second, we get it. Tariffs probably mean higher inflation, and higher inflation probably means the Federal Reserve is going to have to raise interest rates again. So we better get in front of the curve on that. And, bond rates went up. And of course, higher rates in the economy is not good generally for the economy. It causes the economy to slow down. You and I spend less because loans are more expensive. That car we were looking at, we were ready to pull the trigger. Now we're not going to purchase it because the monthly payment's too high. The rates went up. So we pulled back on spending. Same with mortgages, right? And others. So, and businesses don't expand because it's more costly to borrow money and so forth. So higher interest rates are not good for the economy, and Trump knows that. And this is why he stepped in and said, I see the rates going up. I understand why they're going up, because there's fears of these tariffs causing inflation. So what I need to do is try to remove that fear of inflation And then hopefully we'll see bond rates go back down. So that's what happened. So it's more or less he caused the problem that he, ran out and claimed, he saved the day regarding. So he basically tried to fix a major problem that he had caused by threatening these tariffs, which put upward pressure on interest rates. I know that's a mouthful, but that's the gist of what's going on. Tariffs led to higher interest rates in the market, in the bond market. They're bad for the economy. And Trump said, all right, I gotta back off on these tariffs.
Yeah. So here's a question that I have, right? Because the stock market is used. Well, the general purpose is to raise capital for businesses so they can operate. They have a little more money other than whatever profit margin they get. If their stock goes up, then that's more money that they can leverage for loans or wherever the case may be, right? Why would companies in the stock market feel that they have to lose capital, right? That they have to sell these stocks in order to make sure that, to offset what these tariffs are going to do. Explain the logic behind that.
I would look at it maybe as I would talk to my class about it, maybe with a simple example. If you think inflation is going up because of the tariffs, that's going to lead to higher interest rates and slower economic growth. Slower economic growth leads to less production by companies, and companies make up the stock market, right? So if the economy is going to slow, companies don't need to produce as much, and they're not as profitable as a result. Additionally, they start laying off people. That's a second story, but they're not as profitable if they're not producing and selling as much. And in a higher interest rate environment, they're not going to be. So what we saw was, why do you buy stock? Why does it, whether it's a wholesale buyer of stock in the market, a big sophisticated buyer, or a retail buyer like you and me, less sophisticated, or I'll speak for myself on that, a smaller dollar, right? We call that retail investor versus a wholesale. Why do we buy stock? Generally speaking, we buy stock with the anticipation that stock is going up in value, right? We want to profit from it. And what would cause the stock to go up in value? It's when the company becomes more profitable than they are now. So we buy stock in anticipation of a company, doing better than they're doing now. They're going to, maintain solid, if not increasing profits over time. That's why we buy stock. If suddenly we fear increased rates are going to come into play in the future as a result of the higher inflation, as we talked about earlier, that's the same as saying we don't think these companies are going to be as profitable in the future because they're not going to be able to sell as much in a higher interest rate environment. And as we're not interested in buying their stock at this point. And in fact, if I own their stock right now, I bought it in anticipation of them doing very well. I didn't know about this higher interest rate coming because of Trump's tariffs. So the price of the stock that I was anticipating is probably not going to increase like I thought. So I better get rid of it. So what we ended up seeing here with that big drop over a number of days and really sharp drop after he announced the high tariffs is that people said, certainly we're not going to buy any stock. This is going to be bad for the market, these higher interest rates that result from the tariffs. And if I own the stock, I anticipate the company doing worse and their stock price as a result will drop too. So I better sell now. So that's what we saw. People dumping their stock, wholesale and retail, and the price in the markets really collapsed. Over a short period of time, the stock market dropped near record levels in percentage terms. And then interest rates started to go up, as you mentioned, and that further led to the downward movement in stocks. Oh, we thought inflation, higher rates, but the bond market's really moving that way and quickly. So the decline accelerated, and then Trump came out and said, let me pull back a bit on what I said earlier. And it's important for us, and I'll pause here to take your question, to clarify, I think, for your listeners, what exactly he did in terms of pulling back on the tariffs. It's not what certainly the press reports, and it should be concerning to you, me, and your listeners. But I can get into that. But let me stop and see if you have any questions at this point.
Well, I want you to clarify that, but the one last question I was going to ask you was, in light of the stock market, dropping, and then he took the step to end, quote unquote, the tariffs on certain countries. He then got on his social media platform, I guess Truth Social, and said, he basically told people to buy stock is what he did. Now the question was, I can't remember, did he do it before he made the announcement about the tariffs or after? I want to say it was before. He told people to go ahead and start buying stocks, and then he dropped the tariffs. So some people are concerned that was, if it wasn't illegal, it was unethical. So just kind of, what's your take on it? Let's put it that way.
It's sad to say, but you almost assume, most things that Trump and his administration do, are questionable, at least on the margin. It's a shame that we just kind of just assume that anymore, but that's just what he's all about. I don't think he comes to the table with a degree of integrity and ethics, and I'm not a partisan at all, but a degree of ethics and integrity that we've come to expect out of our national leaders. So I don't know if he did that or not, but I just assume he and his friends handsomely profited from that turn in the market. Certainly, I would, be pretty confident on the evidence of this, that certainly folks knew that he was going to make that announcement, folks in his inner circle and beyond. And, they got in anticipation of that sharp increase in the market. Is it ethical? Certainly not. Legal? Probably not. Do we have much time to do we have much time to mess with that issue? Probably not. We could have, many people employed gainfully chasing down Trump and his questionable antics.
Well, Rick, is there anything else you want to add to this discussion? I think what you've contributed has been very helpful for the listeners.
Well, I do. I think the press has more or less reported that Trump has changed his mind and he's pulled back on the tariffs against all countries except for China. That's not what's happened. And let me clarify. He has pulled back, but not eliminated the tariffs. He has still left 10% tariffs in place against most countries. There's a couple exceptions here and there, but let's just say 10% across the board for most countries, against most countries. That happens to be, just to give you a historical perspective, that would be much higher than, in a historical sense, than any tariffs we've seen, even these smooth holiday that we talk about from around the Great Depression time. So this, what he left in place, although much below what he was barking about and threatening, is still meaningful. Now, he says, his phone's ringing off the hook with, depending on who you listen to, between 20 and 70 countries are calling, wanting to negotiate and so forth. Who knows what's going on with that? But as it sits right now, there's still some meaningful tariffs in place against countries, 10%. That's meaningful. That means something in terms of the prices we pay, potential Fed interest rate moves, etc. And slower economy, as we were just talking about. It's not a zero. We didn't go back to no concerns at all. We still have some meaningful concerns. 10%, granted, isn't 30 or 60 or these other numbers he threw out on so-called Liberation Day, but it's still meaningful. Secondly, he raised the tariff in as part of a trade war, I'd say, with China. And it's currently, I think it went from maybe 34, 35% to near more than 130% against China. Okay, so there's two ways to look at that. You say, well, he lowered it all the way down to 10 for everybody else, and then he just bumped it up for only one country. So this isn't that, he's just picking on China, big bad China, right? And there's some, truthness to this big bad comment, right? I don't think they play fair all the time and so forth. So I'm not saying that, but he certainly imposed massive tariffs against China, just one country. However, China is our third largest trading partner after Canada and Mexico. Okay. So that country, China, that is going to have its imports to the U.S. face substantially higher prices, is our third biggest trading partner. So we, as consumers and businesses, as buyers of inputs from China, are going to face much higher prices. And that's inflation as well. And that leads into higher interest rates. I would say, just doing back of the envelope calculations, right, that the impact to inflation before he pulled back was less than the impact to inflation will be to the U.S. after he pulled back. So the fact that he pulled back, it doesn't eliminate inflation concerns and, as a result, high interest rate concerns and so forth. He pulled back in a way. He left a little bit there for most countries, but he really jacked up very high the rate for the country that we trade a lot with. In fact, third most with, China. And we're going to face overall higher inflation if those tariffs remain as is, 10% and 130% against China. That change, people are interpreting it as it's a great change. No more worries about inflation, no more worries about high interest rates in the economy. I go the other way. And this is where the market's starting to go as they start thinking more about what he did, is that, this is not a good move, this pulling back the way he did. This is still going to lead to big time inflation. As a result, when he announced the pullback, we saw the markets rally, record levels, went up very high. You remember, just 2 days ago, right? But what happened yesterday, as some people started thinking more about this and talking somewhat along the lines of what the manner that I just described to you, the thinking is, wait a second, this isn't the best thing since sliced bread. In fact, this is pretty confusing. This may be just the opposite of that. And you saw the market go down yesterday, and today it's probably just bouncing around. So it's very confusing times out there. You, and your listeners should be very careful with jumping into the market saying, well, this is a good time. It's a good buying opportunity. It's reached bottom and so forth. My personal opinion is not so fast. I think we have a ways to go, and maybe I'll lead you with that thought.
Well, Rick, thank you for that. I mean, and that all of it was very enlightening, but that last little bit was very, very helpful, because I know some people who like to, invest in the stock market and invest heavily. And, they play it. And so a lot of them might have thought, okay, now I might be able to get in. But, after further reflection, it's still too volatile for a lot of people. And the biggest concern is those of us who have 401ks or are on public pension plans. The way the volatility of the stock market affects the money that you think you're going to have when you retire. And so I think that your advice basically is to tell everybody, just kind of hold your horses, wait and see what's going on, and before you do anything.
Correct. Well said.
All right. Well, Rick, thank you for coming on and doing this, man. I look forward to talking to you. I think we've got you scheduled later on in the year, but as always, if something's going on and you say, hey, Eric, I need to talk to the folks about this, they need to get the heads up. Just keep doing what you're doing, as far as teaching the future economists of the world, but just enlightening the listeners on this podcast. I greatly appreciate you coming on.
You bet. I appreciate it. I appreciate the work you do. Keep it up.
All right, guys. And we'll catch y'all on the other side. All right. And we are back. So, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank Elrod, Zaha Hassan, Lara Friedman, and Rick Roberts for coming on the program. I hope that y'all got a lot out of that. Just picking the brains of some of the smartest, more committed people in this nation, dealing with issues that impact us all, whether it's politics, our relationship, and what's going on with the Palestinian people in America and in Gaza, and the economy itself, and all this dancing and shaking that President Trump is doing with these tariffs. I really am glad that Rick reached out to explain that and to let us know that regardless of the games that's being played, we're going to be the ones hurt by that. And for Alan and Zaha and Laura, just the type of work that they're doing to increase the political discourse, right? Whether it's a specific issue like what's going on in Gaza or just overall American politics, we've got to have intelligent discourse. We cannot suppress free speech. We just can't do that. And that was the one thing Laura wanted to make sure that I mentioned, that the name of the book is called Suppressing Dissent, Shrinking Civic Space, Transnational Repression, and Palestine-Israel, dealing with the book that her and Zaha worked on to highlight the concerns that they have and others, what we're seeing with the mass deportations and all that stuff, specifically targeting folks that are speaking up for the Palestinians in Gaza. Yeah, we just gotta get to a point, ladies and gentlemen, where we need to be respectful to each other, but we also need to be able to say what we need to say. And, the reason why we have all this volatility, the reason why we have all this unrest, the reason why we have all of this discontent is because people feel that they're not being heard. And you can't have a one-way conversation. It's got to be at least two ways, right? The old saying is you can't listen with your mouth open, right? So, hopefully y'all are getting something out of this. Hopefully y'all feel that, we're contributing to increasing and improving the dialogue. So I'm still looking for 20,000 subscribers, guys. That's the goal I set. Whenever I get to it, it's not like, oh, we got to do it by next month and all this other stuff. I'm being realistic about it, but that's the goal. I'm trying to get to 20,000 subscribers so that we can continue to expand this dialogue in these volatile times without, any interference or encumbrance, right? It's time. It's time for us to raise the level. So I just thank y'all for listening to the podcast. I thank y'all for, spreading the word. For those of you who are going to subscribe or have subscribed, I greatly appreciate that. And we're just going to keep it going. We're just going to keep pushing. So again, thank you to my guests. Thank y'all for listening. Until next time.
NBG Podcast Network.